Hello, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to this new webinar produced by the Cultural Considerations Working Group of the Moon Village Association. I am Remo Rapetti, co-chair of this working group. Today we will focus on a very interesting topic, Afro-Futurism and space law. We strongly think that it is fundamental that space exploration's benefits are shared with the non-spacefaring countries. But we also wish to explore the possibility that these countries can give some kind of contribution to space exploration. Probably their contribution cannot be technological, but many other knowledge domains are essential to peaceful and space exploration. Especially countries like Kenya and other African countries can draw from their cultural traditions, philosophical, anthropological, and legal elements that can be very useful in building a sound cultural infrastructure for future space communities. Today, we have invited a well-known African artist, Jackie Njeri, and the knowledgeable legal anthropologist, Saskia Vermeulen, to deal with these subjects. They have written a joint essay in an interesting book that we discussed in a webinar last year, Reclaiming Space, edited by Jamie Schwartz, Linda Billings, and Erika Nesvold. They are the right persons to introduce new voices into the cultural debate that our working group has been promoting in the last 8 years. Before going to the presentations, I wish to inform that, as usual, we will have a Q&A session run by Lisa Pettibone, famous artist and co-chair of this working group, where attendees can ask questions via the chat button. And now let's go to the presentation. The first speaker is Jackie Njeri. She will talk about Afro-Futurism in space culture. She is a multifaceted artist and designer, currently based in Nairobi, Kenya, with a Bachelor of Arts in Design from the University of Nairobi. Her work blends Afrofuturism, culture, and advocacy, addressing themes of governance, youth, inequality, and gender justice through a futuristic lens. Jackie, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here. Um, I would like to share my screen. As Remo has introduced me, my name is Jackie Njeri, and I'm currently based in Nairobi, Kenya. In summary of what has been said, I am a tech enthusiast and African futurist exploring the intersection of technology, African culture, identity, and space. Seeing space travel as the height of human exploration and the next frontier of the future. And I use it as the tool to inspire people to think outside the box. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, this is an artwork I did in 27 titled History, which is also alludes to history, and it's of a woman leading a space expedition. This artwork was inspired during the elections in my country in 2017, and what I saw was a lack in leadership And with my space and space interest, I wanted to create this message to encourage women in leadership through this artwork, uh, to go more into what I'm saying is that is a Samburu woman, and what is mostly known and what is commonly in the media about the Samburu people is their tradition and their culture, which we can see on the left. And another lived reality that we don't get to see in the media often, but which is also my reality, is the same community also has access to education, and they also aspire for bigger things in in the same effort, right? So among them there is a girl who dreams of going to space one day. But if from my perspective, if the imagery they constantly see about themselves is them in this environments, what then can we do to keep encouraging this interest? And so, in the shifting of the same perspective, I use the Maasai as well, commonly known as the custodians of the Kenyan wild and beautiful landscape, which extends all to onto Tanzania and starts from the Omo Valley going down. And again, the media likes to share these images of these people, but there's also another angle to it. So I created this artwork showcasing an elderly group of Maasai in a space expedition, again to address a quote that was very critical and that made me think a lot. And the Oxfam report had suggested that ancient Maasai wisdom and skills, including the ability to produce food in desert landscapes and scrubland, could be vital to help humans adapt to warming climates. And again, going on with the conversations, from I have looked at the art in the past from the Moon Village, and I have also learned a lot. Is begs to ask how people would survive in space. And so, from my perspective, it's also that if the Maasai have this wisdom and skills that make them able to survive, such harsh landscapes, then what then can they contribute to the space efforts? As people try to struggle with this question, and then again, how can we use their knowledge to create survival in space through the survival diets? So because the Maasai are, I think, strictly carnivorous, and if we look at their patterns, then back to the question, what then can we borrow about their survival that can help people survive in space for longer or better than we're currently doing? And again, how then do we shift the perspective of this little girl who has not been exposed to all these global happenings, who does not know about who knows about space but does not know that there are efforts to go to Mars, who does not have um, the 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 education to do that. So my work generally uses space as this grant scheme or grant thing that you can look at. Even if they don't go to space, then what studies can they get into that would contribute to the push to the future and all these achievements that everyone in the world is trying to um, achieve? Again, a shift in the perspectives of the role of women in our societies, and how that would look like from a perspective that brings it closer home, as much as there's this aspirational ways to look at it with the new I don't know, robotic shiny machines. How then do you bring it back to encouraging people to start with experimental tools that then broaden their knowledge, and that how they can familiarize themselves with all these all these tools and how they can aim to go there. I think I skipped one thing that I wanted to mention about why I use the Maasai or this indigenous tribes people. It's because I respect the way they have been able to maintain and retain their culture and their identity without without influence from all this Western and all this influence that is getting to them. And one of the things that we can do to encourage people not to lose their selves, and their culture through going into tech, because a lot of people feel like they have to shed their Africanness, so to speak, or to shed elements about their culture to fit into this image that has been presented of maybe the educated person, the person in a classroom. Do they have to always be in suits and ties to be considered well versed with space knowledge, or everything to do with astronomy? And so I I like to retain the cultural element, to encourage people to just remain, to not lose who they are as they seek this this push for an idea that seems a bit Western. And again, from sharing my work across the world, one question is often asked, and it's because my work is very futuristic and maybe surrealistic. It seems like a dream that is not achievable. And so I like to go back into this real life application of, people progressing towards aeronautics and space travel through invitations to NASA projects, or by, of African students. So as you can see on the screen here, this is the in Cape Town in 2022, where NASA uh, visited the Cape Town Academy of Math, Science and Technology to engage learners about opportunities for youth and space exploration in South Africans involvement in the Artemis missions. So this to me is full circle to the work that is done as a imagination, and how then it applies in real life, which for me now becomes like it fulfills my work and the expression of that work. And yeah, I think I am done with my presentation for now. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Jackie. Uh, I believe that your books are really beautiful and join the fascination of art with a strong message of justice and peace. And this is a very strong message, I believe. And now it's Saskia Vermeulen's turn. Dr. Saskia Vermeulen is a reader-in-law at the University of Strathclyde, Scotland. She is a phenomenologist and legal anthropologist whose interdisciplinary research explores the interplay of law, space, and cultural expression, offering a unique perspective on space governance informed by art theory and practice. She will talk about cultural storytelling for the protection of outer space. Please, Saskia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. And thank you, Jackie, for showing your very beautiful and, yeah, really important artwork in this area. So I'm also going to attempt to share my screen here. You can see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Oh, let me to do a full screen. Okay, that's better. Okay, so yeah, thank you for the introductions. So yeah, I consider myself more a legal anthropologist than a space lawyer, and that maybe explain why I sort of am interested in cultural expressions, and through the work of Jackie, I also got very much interested in Afrofuturism and looking more widely how actually we can think differently about the law, not just space law, but law on its own, and how we can actually maybe by working with artists and working with art like Jackie's, how we can actually think about law more creatively, and there is a whole kind of emphasis within legal theory, how we can actually, that we need to think more about what we will call like an imaginative jurisprudence, like an imaginative way, an expansive way of thinking about law, which I've been applying to outer space. These are a few articles and also the work I've done with Jackie that we've published in the book that Remo kindly mentioned in his introduction. But I think, yeah, although most of my talk will be more on the cultural expressions, I would like to emphasize a little bit more on why I think the collaboration between Jackie and me, and why it's so important, and how Jackie's work, for example, can really question current space law and really show the gaps which are there, and how by engaging with artists and with cultural aspects that we can think differently about space law. So I don't know how many lawyers there are in the webinar, but space law kind of really entangled with the Cold War, and particularly the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union was a real waking up call that we needed to have an instrument to prevent any kind of warfare in space. And there was a real, particularly when Sputnik was successfully launched, there was almost kind of a psychosis in the US that, you know, the big enemy was there before, and there was this real angst if there would be a spy in the sky. Literally, that was the kind of language that was being used, and that really prompted this idea that space had to be protected as a sort of, the words were not used as a global common, but we can kind of relate to that. It was being mentioned as being the province of, in the language of that time, mankind. And these days we would kind of compare that with that space would be seen as belonging to the commons, and everybody should get access to it, and that it could not be carved up between these two superpowers. And even, you know, that countries with less advanced technologies, that they should also be part of any explorations or exploitations that would happen in the future, that they would be part of it. But as with any piece of legislation, also the international space law, where we have a whole range of different treaties, there's always gaps, and obviously technology has advanced, and not everything has been really well drafted. There's always gaps in the legal language and open for different interpretations. So although, yeah, so we have an international body of space law, but it's not watertight, and we have options for different interpretations. But there's a few principles that are really important in the Outer Space Treaty, and that is that, you know, that outer space and the exploitation of outer space should be in the common interest of all humankind, that any exploration and use of outer space should be carried out for the benefit of all people, irrespective of their economic or scientific development, and that and how we're going to engage and use with outer space should be, you know, for scientific and scientific purposes. And although there was no prohibition of any kind of commercial exploitation, an explicit prohibition, if we look into the the kind of ethics behind the Outer Space Treaty was very much about an ethos of sharing, and that space should not be enclosed by these two superpowers. But we're in a very different era now than from when the time of the Apollo program and the time that most of these international space treaties and ideas and ethics were coming into being. So now some would call it like we're in like a fourth space era, but where the major actors are not so much the US and Russia anymore. We've got lots of new players on, like Japan, China, etc. But what's maybe the most critical aspect is that we have also commercial exploitation looming large, and Elon Musk, for example, it's not unforeseeable in the future that we will have exploitation of resources in space. And this is where we see that there is a real gap in our legal provisions, although some will interpret the International Outer Space Treaty as not prohibiting commercial exploitation. There is still debate about it, and different space lawyers will have a different opinion about it. But it is debatable to what extent the Outer Space Treaty actually prohibits commercial exploitation. It's quite clear in its language that not a country cannot claim any sovereignty. So by the United States planting their flag does not mean that they own the moon. But if Elon Musk would be starting to mine on an asteroid, there the legal language is much more murky and open for different interpretations. But we also have to look into national laws, and there we see a real big progress, allowing actually, and probably as a result of the vagueness in international law, if we can actually mine and own resources in outer space. You see that countries, and particularly the US, but also smaller countries like Luxembourg, that they have now national legislation in place that actually will allow commercial mining in space and owning these resources. So we see a whole kind of propertization being allowed in outer space. And then we also have, it was also already on Jackie's slide as well, we also have a new initiative spearheaded by the United States, the Artemis Accords, which is all about, the next phase into space exploration, and the idea to put a woman on the moon and go further into Mars. And what's really interesting, obviously, first of all, that it's the US really spearheading this. It's been signed up by a lot of countries. I think there may actually be more now than what's on this slide. But what I find really interesting is that it sets the scene by being very explicit in these accords that they will do this according to the International Outer Space Treaty, where the language is not very clear in terms of commercial exploitation being possible or not, versus the Moon Agreement, where there is much more clear language about the future and about benefit sharing, but has not been ratified by enough countries. And therefore, it's not, it's an international treaty without any teeth. But in the Artemis Accords, there is a real explicit mentioning that the next phase of outer space development will be done according to the Outer Space Treaty, which is much more vague in its language. And the US has always been very much against the Moon Agreement, because it did provide for these benefit sharing agreements. If, for example, a company would be starting to mine, would be lucrative, that the idea that these benefits had to be shared with countries, nations who are not technologically advanced, is something that the US has always fought against. Also within the law of the sea, we see something similar. So that kind of sets the scene of where we are at the moment in terms of space law, where we see that there is more of a drive to start regulating and governing space outside an international body, outside the UN, through national legislation and the Artemis Accords, which is not residing under the United Nations. So I've been very much interested by thinking differently about what's the future of space law. Are we going to, can we do something more imaginative? Is there something that we can do differently? So I started to work interdisciplinary around law and the arts, and I've curated an exhibition for which I started to collaborate with Jackie, and I'm just going to show you a few of the artworks and also the kind of inspiration, which kind of links to the work that Jackie has been doing, and a lot of Afro-futurists, and I will show a few examples in a minute, have always been very much influenced by Zambia's space program in the 60s, when Zambia became an independent nation. A science school teacher in Lusaka had the idea that in order for Zambia to become really independent, we also need to have a space program, just like the United States and Russia. And obviously there was some seriousness behind the thinking as well, and I think that seriousness sort of aligns with what Jackie was saying as well. This idea that we as a newly independent Zambian state, we also have knowledge, and we equal to the colonizing countries, and we're not inferior. But there was also a bit of a kind of a parody going on as well. But by making this claim, we're becoming independent. But to become really fully independent, we also need to have this space program. He actually wrote a letter to the space programs in the US and Russia to get funding. They never replied. But he was training his own space cadets, and the whole idea was actually to send a girl to Mars, and not with a dog like the Russian space program, but with a cat. And that space program has actually been very inspirational for a lot of artists. And one example, really very well known, is the work by Natoma Boromo. She's from Ghana, but mostly working and living now in the US, where she made a short film of 10 minutes, kind of revisiting the Zambian space program, and kind of multiple layers in the film. She's now making it into a feature film, and it may already, I don't know how far that has progressed, but I know she was working on that a couple of years ago. And I mean, this work really speaks to that kind of legal imagination as well, how we can think differently. There's some really big ideas about in the film around relationships between humans and non-humans. Also, that there is a big kind of feminist approach into the film as well. So that's been a real inspiration for me to think about how art can actually show a different way of thinking about the law. And then obviously Jackie's work, when I started to put the proposal together to create an exhibition on space law and art, I came across Jackie's work. Yeah, her work was really very, very inspirational, and it really spoke on a very personal level to my own research, because I work mostly with former hunter-gatherers in Namibia, where I've seen another way of being in this world and different knowledge systems, which are, maybe, they may be different to a certain extent to the sciences we get taught in a Eurocentric kind of sense, but nevertheless is also a form of science. So her whole iconography around the Maasai, and we write about that in the book chapter that was mentioned in the introduction, really speaks very much in my own kind of trajectory of working with hunter-gatherers, thinking creatively differently about the law, and then sort of extending that into space. But for the exhibition, I was also very much intrigued and trying to show through working with different arts, not all the artwork that I've been analyzing to think differently about space law is related to space. And this particular work is by the Marikana Widows Collective, which is in response to a big mining strike in South Africa. In Rustenburg, it's mining for platinum, which is a material being used in the space industry. And the workers went on a big strike, and it was a very protracted situation. And eventually, 34 people got killed, got shot by the police, and it was one of the really very violent incidents after quite soon after the end of apartheid. And the women really struggled to get compensation, and it's been a whole messy kind of process. But that work for me, because of the platinum mining and platinum being used as a resource in space, really inspired me to, because space is always being presented, particularly by people like Elon Musk, that it's, you know, space is empty. There is no human rights abuses. There's no environmental abuses. But this, for me, what happened around the mining really, you know, platinum is in space. So for me, these things are really entangled, and space is not something that is far away. I think we can also use space as a thinking ploy about our relations on Earth as well, and that the two are in constant communication. Another piece of work that was really inspirational for me to think about the exhibition that I curated and how I could use art is the work by Yinka Shonibare, who's living in the UK. And he's using the so-called kind of iconic African wax fabrics, but they're also very much entangled with colonialism through the Dutch and their colonies in Indonesia, at the West Indies. And Yinka Shonibare is really layering here through these so-called African waxed fabrics, this kind of continuation, this continuing of colonization in this iconography, in the installations around space. And then, I think Jackie has introduced her work far better than I can do. But it's such a striking image, and for those of you who are interested, we really recommend reading the piece we wrote together, unpacking the layers in this artwork. But I just want to show a few more artworks that were curated in Vienna. And obviously, a lot of the artwork was in response to Yinka Shonibare's work, but also to the Marikana Collective, and wider discussions around space colonization and that we need to learn from our past mistakes. So this piece of work is by an artist based in Vienna, Ralo Meyer, who has used reflective material, which is also used in space explorations, as a way of making the point that space always, that colonization often starts with measurements, and this fabric is actually used to do measurements as well. So it's a whole idea around cartography, measurements, really using the sort of remnants of exploration on space, like the famous imprints of Armstrong's boots, as a way to open up a debate about space colonization. Also, the work of Alan Levi, an American-based artist who has worked a lot around kind of wider critiques around property and closures of sciences, and closure of land, and closure of space through property rights. Intellectual property rights is a really big thing around space as well. So it's not just colonizing physically maybe Moon and Mars, asteroids, etc. But it's also intellectual property rights of, the instruments we're using, a lot of the mechanisms, tools we're using to go into space. A lot of it, of these technologies, etc., will be patented. So her work is augmented with an augmented reality. So if you hover over some parts of the artwork, you see a whole history of enclosures of knowledge and physical spaces being told through a particular kind of lens on these artworks. Then there's a few pieces which was really very nice how artists kind of reacted and were in response to the Marikana collective. So this is a Morse code blanket by two South African artists, and they had conversations with the Marikana collective and talking with them about space and potential space mining. And one of the widows, her reaction was like, well, if our husbands, if our men were not even seen in these mining struggles, what will happen if we start mining in space? All the accidents, everything that will happen there will be completely out of sight, and who's going to listen to us then? And the space, this is the Morse code, is a quote from one of the women's reflections. And then you can see it here better. This is also a work by Dylan McGarry, who then really used this mining strike, the Marikana mining strike, and put that into the context of space mining as a critique of that. We really need to think very carefully, and that we need to learn from what we've done on Earth, and make sure that space law is not repeating the same mistakes. And this is a piece that I've two artworks that I've analyzed in other pieces of my writing. From one is on the right hand is by a collective of artists in the Congo. And they've been sort of really making interesting art around environmental issues, which is obviously a really big problem with our in-space exploration as well. There's a lot of debris. Space is polluted. Space is already enclosed. It's becoming more and more difficult to go into space, and accidents could happen because there's so much debris floating around. So they create all these kind of spacesuits from all sorts of garbage and junk, basically, and then they do kind of performances in Kinshasa, and multiple layers around a kind of imagination as well of how we can travel to space differently. And it's the same with the piece by Emma de Medeiros, using these particular kind of shells, which are really important in a lot of African cultures as a way for divination as well, and that juxtaposition of technology with I wouldn't want to call it tradition. It's just a different vernacular, which I think is really important, that we treat these things not just as something as essentializing or traditional, but something that is coming from a different vernacular. So I've kind of analyzed these pieces of art as well as a different way how we can imagine law differently, and it sort of shifts the attention within space, within international law. There's often this kind of sense that that we have a right to exploit these things, and I use it to think differently about property, about how we should benefit this, how we should have the benefit sharing, how some of these elements that are really important in terms of governing space, often the ethics, the laws are being thought through a very Eurocentric lens. And what I make the point is that these artworks actually show us a different way of thinking about these issues. And this was a science fiction story. This is the last thing by Pippa Goldschmidt, who used to be working as a scientist, but is now a science fiction writer. And this is a space story set in Scotland. So that's an ode to where I'm sitting at the moment. Okay, that's me done.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. Lisa, can we go to the, do you have any comments, any question?
Yeah, thank you for both of those presentations. So much to think about. I really loved seeing the other artworks, Jackie, and hearing you talk about them a little bit. I think one of the things that I'm curious about is how several aspects of Afro-Futurism you're drawing on. One thing I'd like to know more about is how perhaps Kenyan societies or Maasai groups, their sense of society, how that could be merged into ways of thinking about living in space and perhaps living on the moon eventually. Oh, great.
Right. So I think to what I mentioned earlier about borrowing from cultures that exist in different environments, they do possess a different knowledge system or intelligence systems of survival that we can um, mimic or learn from, or even have them in the in the space as a form of inclusion to teach or to equip different people on ways to survive. So the I think the research that was done on the Maasai was their, I think, very unique way of surviving and their unique diet that keeps them super healthy, super nourished despite the odds. And I think any other person who would, I think, engage would typically think of it as impossible. So so there's a lot to learn from different people who live within different environments. The same way as an African, I'd also bring in a fresh perspective on the same, despite not being from leading a nomadic lifestyle, simply by way of community, by way of there's a thing we call nyumba kumi in Kenya, which translates to 10 houses, which as a community means that you take it upon yourself to know at least 10 people who live around you as a way of safety and as a way of keeping tabs on each other and as a way of just helping each other. So I think different communities have different ways of survival that can be used by communities in general. And I think to add on to that was also very interesting quote that I read today morning. I don't know the person who was quoted, but it said it's so unfortunate that people who aren't as articulate come off as unintelligent. I try to be cognizant of that bias all the time. Just because people haven't learned as many words doesn't mean their thoughts aren't as valid. And that really speaks into what Saskia was talking about earlier about the Namibian community, I think, and especially the Himba that I'm very drawn to because of the culture that they lead and the lifestyle that they lead. And I also think about of this in a very grand scheme of the world, where outside of where I live, but also think about communities in Australia, the Aboriginals. When you think about societies in South America, and how much of that knowledge I do not, some of that knowledge they possess that I do not have because of that gap in communication. So I think also long term, the way of thinking would be, you know, um, how would inclusion bring different perspectives to maybe fasten or maybe improve what we already have in place in terms of things like space travel or space exploration. I hope that answers you.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about the communities and the philosophy around the way the Maasai communities are knitted together. Seem as though they might be really beneficial to how we plan communities in space. And it might be slightly different than the Western way of building communities. So I was curious about that as well.
So I don't think I'm equipped to really answer that satisfactorily, but top of mind, what I can think of is the lead. They also the only way I could answer that is through the knowledge systems of the solar system,
Okay.
and how they survive through moving their communities through the study or the knowledge of um, their own understanding of space and how it works. So the Maasai community lead a very nomadic lifestyle, which means survival here might not be survival tomorrow. So how they plan around also, I think, their infrastructure, and how they use already existing, let's say, earth to build um, the 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 society and infrastructure around. So also it comes with I think in summation is their knowledge comes with a lot of improv
Yeah.
from their environment. So instead of like spending a lot of millions taking equipment to space, what can we find in space to navigate our way around? And that is, I think, something that that would be helpful at some point.
Yeah. Thank you very much for answering that. So Saskia, what was attractive to you about the about Afrofuturism, and that I mean, something I might have picked up on was this way of decolonizing space, or the kind of philosophy around colonization, moving the story on, and this would include a lot of indigenous communities having a basis for seeing themselves somewhere else completely, and sharing that and acknowledging that the future can look very different. So is there anything you'd like to add to that or go into in more depth?
Precisely what you were kind of drawing out there is this idea that we can think differently about the past, and project then new kind of futures, which are to some extent maybe utopian, but to another extent also showing a pathway to see things differently and to do things differently and to learn from other cultures, and where things may be organized in a different way, where people, in terms of their relations with nature and resources and amongst humans are very different. But I really like why I was really kind of sort of drawn to it is that it really shows that there is a history, first of all, because I think we often think that for a lot of these communities that Jackie has been referring to in her artwork, and that I've been lucky enough to have been welcomed to study there, is we often see them as without a history, because the history starts with the moment that the colonizers arrive. But there is a really long history. There is a lot of knowledge there, and I think so I think in the Afrofuturism, it's that kind of history that we kind of unearth and show and work with. But on the other hand, also this big critique against colonialism as well, this kind of and imagining what would have happened if the world would have been, if we wouldn't have had colonialism, and if we wouldn't have had a different past, how would the future look like? So I think these are very attractive ideas for me to think about law in a more imaginative way.
Yeah, it opens a much more creative outlook for everyone, really, and stepping aside stereotypes, about what we think will be going on in space, who will be there, what they'll be doing, all of these things, because we know that new communities will be formed and new traditions will be formed, and it won't look like the 1960s. So that's something really swirling around, and I think people like yourself and Jackie are kind of getting a hold of that and just shaking it up a little bit. So I'm hoping planners will take a look at that as well and see what can contribute to making people all over the world really excited about space.
But maybe also one thing to add, and I don't know, Jackie, how you feel about that, but I also feel like maybe the future may be more in space, that it will be artificial intelligence, robots. It may not necessarily be, there may be some humans, but it could well be that it's different kind of entities. And this is where I think that people like Masai, the son that I've been working with, they are very well connected and educated in working with a different realm and working with, with non-humans or more than humans. And so I think sort of learning from that kind of imagination and could be quite interesting, because it may not be humans in space.
Yeah.
No, likely it will be artificial intelligence that will be leading us into space.
Rima, did you have any questions for either of them?
Yes, maybe I have a question for Jackie. Do you work alone, or are there other Kenyan artists that you collaborate with in a sort of movement engaged in social issues?
Right. I work from home and I'm a digital artist, so that kind of automatically limits my way of movement. But I have had a chance to collaborate on certain projects in the past with people who share a certain vision and bring different skill sets. I'll give you an example. For example, right now I'm working on a project that is also space related, and the vision for it will involve a fashion designer, will involve a jeweler, will involve a stylist and a photographer. And so for us to collaborate and bring a certain vision to life, I have to also use their knowledge to create this vision. So yes, as much as I work alone, I find time and projects that bring collaboration and also make the idea bigger in that sense. So, because from the work that I have shared, this is work from photographs that I use to create a montage around it. But when I want to use original artworks, I do shoot myself, and in that way, my work opens up to collaboration.
Okay. I don't have any more questions.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about elaborating on something else. I was really interested in the prospect of learning more about, say, Kenyan traditions and their relationship with the night sky. Are there many traditions and the way they see a different mythology? Are some of those really interesting to you as well?
So yes, there are long histories of communities like the Samburu, where I haven't delved really into the research, but I know of their connection with, let's say, the pyramid, and how they can tell that a certain planet is aligned with, another particular planet in another country in Egypt, that sort of also advises their migration systems, that tells them this is the season to move. I know that exists, and there's, as Saskia mentioned, also like long histories. that have not been documented, that we cannot tap into. However, what is left that is passed down by way of word of mouth does tell tales and mythologies about the interactions of different communities with the night sky. And for example, like talking about the modern community right now, there is a specific spot in the Kenyan Rift Valley that has been marked as an astro-tourism center because of just the clarity of space from that vantage point. So if this exists, then that means there are people from, years back who also observed these patterns of the solar system or of the night sky. So yes, they do exist.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Maybe I have still a question for Saskia. In a recent seminar organized by NASA, were invited also native people, and they expressed their criticism because someone sent to the moon human ashes. Do you think that we should respect this kind of let's say way of thinking of native people, and what can we do when humans will go to the moon and someone will die?
Interesting question. Yeah, I mean, for a lot of indigenous peoples across different parts of the world, they have a huge affinity with space, and ancestors will be there, and again, it sort of what I said before, what we may be seeing as an empty space may for other cultures not be an empty space, and their ancestors may be there. So I think we need to, I think we need to be careful with what we send into space, and that's not just human remains, but I think a lot of things are being sent there that I think we need to be really very careful that we do not enclose that space for other ritual purposes, and we need to talk about that. And yeah, your other question about what do we do if people die in space, I would not have an answer to that, because for me, in my view, if I think about a sort of future in space, as I said before, I see it more around artificial intelligence and than necessarily a big human presence.
I see. Okay. Is there any question from the audience?
I don't see anything here. I don't know if there's been other. Let me just check. There's nothing in the Q&A. So anyway, this is recorded on. It'll be up and on YouTube later, so a lot more people will see it there. And you never know what questions might pop out of that. But
okay, so I think that we can wrap it up, and I wish to thank our two very interesting speakers, and thank you, Lisa, for running the Q&A. And I hope that there will be other chances to collaborate. Thank you very much.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Really nice to meet you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.